Hello, Bravs. We're back with Tried for Life by E.D.E.N. Southworth. Chapter 14. The Trial for Life. If you condemn me, fie upon your law. There is no right in the decrees of judges. I stand for justice. Answer, shall I have it? Shakespeare. The awful contrast that there was between her appearance of the fairest freedom and her reality of the darkest bondage. But she scarcely realized such a contrast until that morning when she arose and threw open her south window and looked out upon her own beautiful home valley, now fresh with the verdure of early spring and radiant with the light of the young day. A luminous haze like sifted gold dust hung around the mountain tops. A dewy freshness sparkled on their wooded sides, and the river lay like a clear mirror below. Must she leave all this for the terrors of the courtroom? She inquired with a shudder of her shrinking heart. And for a moment she felt that even the gloom of the prison might have better prepared her to meet the horrors of a trial for life than this peaceful, bright home staying had done. Yes, the contrast between her surroundings and her impending ordeal seemed an awful mockery of fate. She knew that the court would open for the spring term that day, but she did not know that she would be wanted so soon. They were all at breakfast that morning in the cheerful front parlor. Mr. and Mrs. Berners, their protege Raphael, their little adopted baby boy Cromarty, who always sat in a high chair beside his benefactress, Beatrix Pendleton, who was resolved to stay with Sybil to the last, and Tabitha Winterrose, who sat at the head of the table to serve out the coffee and tea, because Sybil had said that everything tasted better coming from old Tabby's hand. These were all gathered around the table when Sheriff Fortescue was announced and entered the room. "You have come for me," said Sybil in a low, terrified tone, as she arose from her seat before anyone else could move or speak. "Resume your seat, Mrs. Berners, and finish your breakfast. There is no hurry," answered the old gentleman, as calmly as he could. Then he saluted the party, shook hands with Mr. Berners, and accepted the seat offered him by Joe. "She is wanted this morning?" inquired Mr. Berners, in a low voice. The sheriff bowed gravely in assent. Sybil had been kindly pressed to resume her seat and finish her breakfast. She sank back into her chair indeed, but could not eat another morsel, nor could anyone else at the table, not even poor little Crow, who saw by the faces of all around that something terrible had happened, or was about to do so. The meal was at an end. The breakfast party arose in trepidation. "Is she wanted now immediately?" hastily inquired Lion Berners. The sheriff again bowed in assent, but added, "I do not wish to hurry her." "I will not keep you waiting, Mr. Fortescue," said Sybil, trying to steady her voice as she prepared to leave the room. But here little Crow, who had been watching everybody anxiously, found out by some process of his own that the terrible thing which was going to happen threatened Sybil, and he slid down from his high chair at the risk of breaking his limbs and ran to her and clung to her dress. "Take him away, Miss Tabby. Sybil is going to Blackville, Crow, and she will bring Crow some candy when she comes back," she said tenderly, placing the child in Miss Winterrose's arms. Mr. Berners told Joe to have the carriage brought around and to prepare to drive it, and then he gave his arm to Sybil, who really needed its support, and going up to her chamber. Beatrix followed her. Raphael walked up and down the length of the breakfast room in uncontrollable agitation. Miss Tabby clasped the child to her bosom, and rocking him and herself to and fro, wept and sobbed bitterly. "And as for me, I feel like a hangman," muttered old Mr. Fortescue to himself, as he stood looking moodily out of the window. Mr. Fortescue had not been High Sheriff very long, and was new to the ghastly duties of his office. To be sure, he might have easily departed this irksome task to another, but he chose to perform it himself, lest that others should not do it so kindly. In a few moments Sybil returned, ready for her drive. She was dressed. Her dress was afterwards minutely described in the county paper, and also in many others that reported the trial. She was dressed then in a light grey suit throughout, bonnet, mantle, and gown being of the same material, and even gloves and veil of the same hue. A pale blush rose relieved a pale blush rose relieved the neutral shade of her bonnet, and a ribbon of the same delicate tint fastened her small linen collar. Beatrix Pendleton, in a black silk suit, with a black lace bonnet and shawl, followed her. Beatrix, with the warm approbation of her brother, had determined to sit in the dock beside Sybil. She, the falsely accused lady, should not go there unsupported by the presence of another lady. Goodbye, Raphael. Goodbye, Miss Tabby. I hope to be back this evening. Goodbye, dear little crow. Sybil will bring you something good when she comes, said Mrs. Berners, with all the cheerfulness she could command. But Raphael turned pale as death when he silently gave her his hand. Miss Tabby could not speak for hysterical sobs. Little Crow cried outright. To shorten this trying scene, Mr. Berners drew his wife's arm within his own and led her to the carriage. He had just settled her in the back seat when little Nellie rushed past everybody and ran up the steps and crouched breathless and palpitating at the feet of her mistress. Yes, let her stay, Lion, said Sybil, lifting the faithful little creature to her lap. Mr. Berners next helped Miss Pendleton to a seat beside his wife, then entered the carriage and took his place opposite Sybil, while Mr. Fortescue got in and sat down in the fourth seat, facing Beatrix, and Joe got his order to drive on toward Blackville. Scarcely a word was spoken for the first mile. It was Sybil who broke the silence. Will my counsel meet me at the court, Mr. Fortescue? She inquired. They are waiting for you, madam. Mr. Worth has arrived and is in earnest consultation with Mr. Sheridan, gently replied Mr. Fortescue. How long do you think the trial will last, Mr. Fortescue? Tremblingly inquired Sybil. It is quite impossible to form an opinion, madam, replied the sheriff. My dear Sybil, said Lion Berners, let us hope and trust that the trial will be short, and the result acquittal. Keep up your courage. But he who gave her that advice found his own heart fast failing him. He could fearlessly have met his fate in his own person, but in the person of his beloved wife? Fortunately for our unhappy party, it was not generally known that the accused lady would be put on trial this day. So when they drove into Blackville, they found no more than the usual little crowd about the hotel and the courthouse. The carriage was drawn up before the last named building. The two gentlemen got out and assisted their companions to alight. As they were about to enter the courthouse, Sybil lifted her hand to draw her gray veil before her face, but Beatrix stayed her. Don't do it, my dear Sybil. You have no need to cover your face or bend your head or even lower your eyes before the gaze of anyone alive, she said proudly for her friend. Sybil felt the force of these words, and indeed her own pride seconded their advice. I will take you first to my room, where your counsel are waiting to speak with you, said old Mr. Fortescue, drawing Sybil's hand through his arm and leading her, followed by her husband and her friend, into the sheriff's office. There they found Mr. Sheridan standing at a long table covered with green baize and laden with papers. With him was a gentleman whose grandeur and beauty of person and manner must have deeply impressed any beholder under any circumstances. The form of Apollo and the front of Jove had been said of him, and if it had been added that he possessed the intellectual power of a Cicero and shared the divine spirit of Christ, it would have been equally true. Mr. Worth, late of the Washington bar, now admitted to practice here for your benefit, Mrs. Berners, said Mr. Sheridan, presenting his colleague after he himself had greeted the party. Sybil lifted her glance to meet the gaze of the pure, sweet, strong spirit that looked forth on her from Ishmael Worth's beautiful eyes. Sybil Berners might have been presented to half the weak-minded kings and vain queens on their moldering old European thrones, without the slightest trepidation. But before this glorious son of the soil, this self-made man of the people, this magnate of the American bar, this monarch of noble nature's crowning, this magnificent Ishmael Worth, her spirit bowed in sincere homage, and she lowered her eyes and curtsied deeply before she offered him her hand. Holding that little hand between his own, he spoke a few strong, reviving words to her. He told her, in the first place, that he had spent the whole night in making himself master of her case, that his firm faith in her innocence would give him great power as her advocate, that he would do his best for her sake, but that while doing his best, they must lean on divine providence for support and deliverance, who, in his own good time, later, if not sooner, would vindicate the innocent. And as he uttered these words, looking down in her face, he infused into her soul comfort and courage, and patience to meet the worst this first day of trial might bring. But no one knew better than Mr. Worth the almost utter hopelessness of the cause he had undertaken to defend, and that was no small sacrifice for an eminently successful barrister like Ishmael of Worth, who had never in the course of his professional career lost a single case. To withdraw himself from his own bar and business and take much trouble to get admitted to practice at another, for the sake of defending an utter stranger in whose case there seemed not more than one chance in 1,000 of success. But if there had not been even that one slight chance, still the magnanimity and tenderness of Ishmael Worth's nature would have brought him to the accused lady's side, her defender to the death. Something like this passed through the mind of Lyon Berners as he grasped the hand of Mr. Worth and warmly thanked him. And then the sheriff drew Sybil's arm within his own to lead her on. Lyon Berners offered his arm to Beatrix Pendleton and followed them. The counsel brought up the rear. Thus the little procession entered the courtroom. The presiding judge, Joseph Ruthven, sat on the bench with two associate judges, the one on his right hand, the other on his left. A few lawyers and law officers sat or stood around in groups. On the judge's extreme right, a little below the bench, two long seats were occupied by witnesses for the prosecution. On the extreme left was the jury box. In the intermediate space in front of the bench stood the prisoner's dock, the witnesses' stand, and the counsel's tables. The remaining portion of the room nearest the front doors was filled up with the spectators' seats, but very few spectators were present, only some dozen villagers who had nothing better to do than to loiter there, and some score of farmers who had that morning come to market and had dropped in to see what might be going on at the court. Great was their excitement when they saw Mrs. Berners led in by the sheriff and followed by her friends. They had not expected her trial would come on so soon. Indeed, an absurd rumor had prevailed that she would not be brought to trial at all. But now here she was, sure enough, and they stared at her with dilated eyes and open mouths. Sybil impulsively put up her hand to drop her veil, but remembering Beatrix Pendleton's words, she refrained and turned and swept her proud eye round upon the gazers, whose lids fell under her glance. She was not put into the dock, but offered a chair at the table with her counsel. She bowed to the bench before taking her seat. On her right sat her husband, on her left her friend Beatrix Pendleton, near her counsel. She was very much agitated, but a pressure from the hand of her husband, a glance from the eyes of Ishmael Worth, helped to reassure her. Nor must the fidelity of another friend, a poor little four-footed friend, be forgotten. Little Nellie had faithfully followed her mistress, and now lay curled up at her feet. Meanwhile, the preliminary forms of the trial proceeded. The jurymen were sworn in and took their seats. Then Mr. Sheridan touched his client's hand to call her attention, while the clerk of arraigns, standing up with an open document in his hands, directed the accused to listen to the reading of the indictment. Sybil raised her head and became attentive while that officer read aloud the terrible instrument, setting forth that Sybil Berners of Blackhall, in the county of Blank, being instigated thereto to diabolical agency, did, with malice aforethought, on the night of the 31st of October ultimo, feloniously break into the chamber of Rosa Blondell, then residing at Blackhall, in the county of Blank, and there did unlawfully and maliciously stab, kill, and murder the said Rosa Blondell, etc., etc., etc. During the reading of this indictment charging her with a crime at once so base and so atrocious, Sybil's emotions were all revolutionized. No longer unmerited shame and terror had power to bend her soul. The fiery spirit of her race arose within her. The burning blood boiled in her veins. A fierce indignation flushed from her dark eyes like lightning from a midnight cloud. Bitter scorn curled her beautiful lips. When told to stand up, to hold up her hand, and to answer whether she were guilty or not guilty of the felony laid to her charge, she answered haughtily, not guilty, of course, as everyone here knows, or should know. No more guilty than were many of the queens and princesses of old who were martyred for crimes that we in these days know they never committed. She had exceeded the forms of law and said more than was necessary, but her heart was on fire, and she could not help it, and no one interrupted her. How will you be tried? Proceeded the clerk of arraigns, trying to avoid the beautiful, terrible eyes that were gazing on him. By God and my peers, if indeed I have any peers here, answered this arrogant young Berners, sweeping her eyes once more over the rustic occupants of the jury box, and returning to her seat. Her words and manner did her no good. Their only effect upon the jury was to convince them that Mrs. Berners had inherited all the furious passions of her forefathers, and that she was an excessively high-tempered and high-spirited young lady, quite capable of doing a very rash deed. Patience, patience, my dearest one, whispered her husband, as he passed his arm behind her. I cannot be patient or prudent lying under such insults. I cannot, if they kill me, she fiercely whispered back. I think I will close at this point, as this chapter goes on and on. Yes, I will stop. All right, bruv. That's all for today. Goodbye. Goodbye. Goodbye.